Recording. Welcome to Psychology Social Hour, hosted by the St. Joseph Museums. My name is Shelley Haynes, and this evening we have Miss Sarah Halter. She is the Executive Director for the Indianapolis, Indiana Medical History Museum. Before I let her take over, I would like to read this disclaimer. This free virtual series features an educational program on a topic of mental health. This event is for generalized information and is in no way a form of diagnosis. Please consult with your doctor or therapist for specific medical or psychological advice. We are merely starting the discussion to help destigmatize mental health. Mental illnesses, symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment methods are all a highly individualized process. And with that, Miss Sarah, the floor is yours.
All right, let me share my screen. Um, oops. And the menu for Zoom. Okay. Are you guys able to see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Hello. I am delighted to be here this evening. So I want to thank Shelley for inviting me to speak, and I want to thank everyone who's watching. I appreciate your interest in the Indiana Medical History Museum. Our name does sound a little bit boring. I promise you it's much more exciting than the name would imply. Um, it's really a place I love a lot. It's unique in a lot of ways, and so I'm happy to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. I'm assuming that most of you folks who are watching have not been to the museum and probably have not even heard of it. A visit in person is really an immersive and unique experience, and so I would encourage you to visit if you're in Indianapolis, but I will also try to do it justice here. We are housed in what is known as the old pathology building. That's what you see on the screen here. That's a nickname for the building, but it's one that stuck, and it's what we're called on the National Register of Historic Places. But officially, when it was a functioning laboratory facility, this was the pathological department of what was called at that time Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane. This is 1896. It was a cutting edge research facility with goals of educating medical students about psychiatry and neurology, and also researching the physical causes of mental illnesses. So things like tumors, lesions, circulatory problems, congenital defects, and degenerative diseases, things like that. This was groundbreaking work at the time, and it came in response to some pretty serious problems that the hospital faced in trying to treat patients and return them to their homes and families. I want to talk a bit today about the early history of the hospital because it's an important history to remember and share today, but it's also a really important part of our story, the story of our building and why it exists, and also the story of the museum as an organization. Today, most people who do remember the hospital know it as Central State Hospital. That's what it was called when it closed in 1994, but it opened in 1848 as the Indiana Hospital for the Insane. It was located on what is now the near west side of Indianapolis. We feel like we're pretty much downtown, but in 1848, this was pretty far out there. It was mostly farmland at the time, and it was pretty far removed from the city itself. And it was the first state mental hospital in Indiana. Though the name doesn't sound very innovative or modern by today's standards, it really was for its time. Before the hospital opened, poor Hoosiers, that's what we call ourselves in Indiana. Is that generally known outside of the state? we
I
can't, you've
yeah,
heard it? Okay, we can't
depends.
agree on why we're Hoosiers, but that's what we call ourselves. So poor Hoosiers with severe mental illness frequently ended up in poorhouses or jails where they were often treated the same as criminals. They were often perceived the same way too, and that was whether they had actually committed a crime or not. Some families could keep their loved ones confined at home or even in attics or barns or other out of the way places. And later on, nicer, almost resort like sanitariums were available for families with more means. But early on, the idea really was to keep people out of sight and out of mind of the public. This drawing depicts a cabin that was erected in what is now downtown Indianapolis. The state of Indiana set aside this parcel of land called Square 22 or Hospital Square in 1827 for use as a lunatic asylum. It wasn't a hospital, it wasn't even really a true asylum. It was really just what you see here, a cabin that served as a place of confinement for people who were deemed insane. I like to share this quote from Dorothea Dix. This is from an address to the Massachusetts legislature in 1843 after she conducted a statewide investigation into the care for mentally ill in that state. I come to present the strong claims of suffering humanity. I come to place before the legislature of Massachusetts the condition of the miserable, the desolate, the outcast. I come as the advocate for the helpless, forgotten, insane men and women of being sunk to a condition from which the unconcerned world would start with real horror. A lot of people remember Dix for her work during the Civil War as the superintendent of Army nurses for the Union Army, but before the war, her activism focused on asylum reform and improving care for and treatment for mentally ill people in the United States. This interest began while she was teaching classes to female prisoners in East Cambridge, Massachusetts. She noticed that many of the individuals incarcerated there had medical needs that weren't being addressed. And she noticed that many of them were not criminals at all. The poor and the mentally ill there, who had either committed no crime or whose crimes were directly related to their poverty or mental illness, were locked up alongside violent criminals and treated in the same inhumane way and sometimes worse. Dix began traveling to other states beginning in the 1840s, including Indiana, visiting the places where people with mental illnesses were housed and treated, and this included jails as well as hospitals. And she lobbied state governments for better facilities in which to care for these helpless, forgotten people. Her work contributed to the establishment of hospitals like Indiana Hospital for the Insane. In the late 1840s, the hospital was established in line with the ideas of what was known as moral treatment. This widespread movement came in response to humanitarian reform efforts led by Quakers and an emerging idea in medicine that mental diseases were just that. They're diseases like other diseases. They could be treated as other diseases could, at least in theory, given the state of medicine at the time. And it was an early effort to get away from the asylum system and the idea that people living with mental illnesses were just innately bad, that they were being punished by God for moral failings, or worst of all, that they were beyond hope or unworthy of help. This painting, which hangs in the library of the Indiana Medical History Museum, depicts the precursor of that movement. The man in the funny hat with the cane, here he is. It's Philippe Pinel. He was a doctor during the French Revolution, and this scene is set just after the Reign of Terror ended. And in it, Pinel is liberating the female inmates at the Salpêtrière Women's Asylum in Paris. He's ordering the attendants to remove their chains. He argued that these women were not bad, they were afflicted, and that we can help them by trying to understand what's wrong and treating them like patients who are sick rather than criminals who should be confined and punished. Later proponents of moral treatment stress that with more care, with structured daily lives, beautiful architecture and landscaping, lots of fresh air and sunshine, and what then passed for medical care, people's conditions and therefore people's lives could improve. The entire landscape of the hospital and the design of the buildings, like this one, were considered to be therapeutic. In the previous, or not previous slide, but the one before that, I showed you the original hospital building. This later building is the Department for Women. When this opened about 1879, the original building became the Department for Men, and both of these buildings were Kirkbride style buildings. Thomas Story Kirkbride was an alienist, or what we would now call a psychiatrist, at a similar state hospital in Pennsylvania. His designs for asylum buildings kind of became the gold standard in the 19th century, and hospitals all over the US adopted these concepts in their building designs. They have a central section that houses the hospital administration and offices, and then flanking wards to the left and right that form a shallow V shape that I'll show you in a moment. These are the areas where the patients lived, and the design allowed for really wide hallways that encouraged patients to spend time out with other people, and they allowed for a window in each of the patient rooms that brought in a lot of natural light and sunshine, as well as fresh air into the spaces. The hospital grounds, especially by the early 20th century, had flower gardens, a lot of trees, walking paths, fountains, and gazebos. This is an image of the rock garden that was in an area of the grounds known as the Grove. And then this is, I can't tell you which building this is, but it's an image that shows one of the hospital's many dining halls where the patients and the staff had their meals. A lot of the staff lived on the grounds up until the late 1930s, early 1940s. A lot of the staff was there all the time, even when they weren't on duty. And this shows you that shallow V shape. This is from an 1898 Sanborn fire insurance map that shows both the original building and the later women's department building. This whole concept was powerful, and just using the word hospital in Indiana Hospital for the Insane implied that the goal was to help people get better and not just to lock them away. Turns out, though, this was a huge step in the right direction. It was largely ineffective. It provided more humane treatment and improved living conditions for many patients. It eased burdens on families, and it marked the beginning of a very slow change in public and medical perceptions about mental diseases and the people who suffered from them. But with a complete lack of understanding of the nature of these diseases and no effective arsenal of therapies, there wasn't a whole lot that doctors could do. Modern medicine was just beginning to develop. But nevertheless, supporters of the new hospital bragged that 8 or 9 patients in 10 would be cured and returned to their families. This rosy picture they created and their lofty goals just weren't reasonable expectations. And in that sense, the hospital was not exactly a success. There's another layer of failure here that I always think is important to acknowledge whenever I'm speaking about the hospital's history. And that is that almost from the beginning, allegations of abuse and neglect, nepotism, mismanagement of funds, political cronyism, all of these problems, these allegations were made, and unfortunately, they were not unfounded. These things were rampant, in fact. And on top of all of that, a lot of the staff, including doctors and nurses, as well as attendants and other employees, were poorly paid, poorly trained, and poorly equipped emotionally to handle these really high stress jobs that they had. And so on, on top of all of the administrative problems and the problems with the operation of the hospital, you had people who weren't prepared to deal with the things that they encountered there. There also weren't enough of them to go around. And so the hospital was perpetually, overcrowded and underfunded, and all of this was frequently reflected in the level of care that the patients received. This image is from a memoir that's called Indiana Crazy House. It's a memoir published in the 1880s by a former patient named Albert Thayer. He first published it as a series of scathing editorials in the newspaper about his time at the hospitals and the horrors that he witnessed there. Not everyone had such a terrible experience at the hospital, and there are a lot of even first-person accounts from patients who had very positive experiences that stayed with them the rest of their lives. But on the other hand, Albert Thayer was not alone either. This was not an uncommon experience, unfortunately. Patients at hospitals like this one were also frequently ostracized by their families and by society. They were isolated there from their communities and to some extent from each other within the hospital's grounds. Part of the moral treatment called for strict daily schedules and rules of behavior that meant that even for patients who had grounds privileges and more freedoms, there were a few times during the day when they really could interact freely and in meaningful ways with the people around them. In the late 19th century, the hospital's problem with overcrowding continued to get worse as it did with its other problems, and the Indiana Hospital for the Insane, like many other similar hospitals of the time, filled up with patients, many of whom were not likely to recover quickly, if at all. And that was the state of affairs when, in 1893, this gentleman, Dr. George F. Edenharter, became superintendent of what was by then called Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane. Hospitals like this one were massive and expensive to build and operate, and in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, other state hospitals were popping up all over Indiana. Again, they quickly filled up with patients who were often there long term, and as one hospital filled up, another would open to fill the growing need. Dr. Edenharter recognized that despite anybody's best intentions, the system was just not working the way it was intended, and the solution to him seemed pretty obvious: an investment in research. He felt that in order to help patients recover and reclaim their lives, it was necessary to learn the causes of their mental diseases and find actual, effective, and hopefully non-traumatic cures. And beyond that, it was important to make sure that physicians in the state could recognize symptoms early and help patients find appropriate treatment before it was too late. Being very astute, Edenharter also understood that a financial investment by the state of Indiana into pathological research would go far beyond helping the patients, which was his primary goal. But it would also save the state money in the long run by eliminating the seemingly constant need for new hospitals. Dr. Edenharter understood the importance of this emerging field of pathology, and he brought national attention to the hospital and to the state of Indiana when he established the pathological department in 1895 and opened the brand new cutting edge research facility in 1896. It was only the second pathology laboratory of its kind in the United States, and it was considered the most modern. So it was a big deal for the hospital and for Indiana. And so, right, this is Dr. Edenharter, of course, his grand vision on the left, and then the other image is the floor plans for the pathological department. When he began planning, it was a modest 4-room laboratory on one level, and he got a little carried away. But we're glad that he did, because now the building houses the Indiana Medical History Museum, and you can see all of these spaces still intact. Over the years, as science and medicine advanced, new technologies became available. The pathological department really struggled to maintain that modern reputation that it started with. And in 1968, it closed as a laboratory with most of its original artifacts still there: the furnishings, tools and equipment, the library, records, specimens, all of these things were left intact. These photos show you how little has changed in the building since it first opened in 1896. I was telling Shelley this before we started. I'm sure it was very frustrating for the scientists and the physicians who were trying to work here in the late 1960s. But it really is an incredible and rare dream come true for us as historians to have such an authentic and immersive historic site. You won't see anything like this anywhere else in the United States from this period. When the pathological department at Central State closed in 1968, it hadn't changed very much, and everything in it was old and antiquated. It was all outdated, and the hospital didn't feel they could use it anywhere else. So the building was actually slated for demolition, along with several other 19th century buildings on the hospital grounds, and the plan was to just get rid of all of the stuff. Um, the hospital superintendent at the time, Dr. John Keating, visited the building before its scheduled demolition and was struck by the historic integrity and its significance. And he felt it was an incredible time capsule and he didn't want to see it destroyed and lost forever. And neither did several of his colleagues, including a neurologist named Dr. Charles Bonsett. So Dr. Keating moved the hospital's EEG lab into the old funeral parlor of the building, which is now our break room. Is not super convenient. And that prevented its immediate demolition and bought them some time to work with the governor to save it. Again, this was a state hospital, so it was state property and part of a state agency. And meanwhile, Dr. Bonsett also took action. He moved his Indiana Neuromuscular Research Laboratory into the old pathology building from the relatively new Bar Treatment Center on the other end of campus. This lab occupied a small 1930s addition to the back end of the building, which is the only only change to the architectural configuration of the building that's been made. This is where our offices are now. But this left the laboratories and most of the other rooms in the building with their historic integrity intact. A few historic buildings and sites are as original as the old pathology building is. Dr. Bonsett conducted his research on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy right here in these offices, and he ran a clinic for muscular dystrophy patients as well, and that's what you see in the image. Uh, this was also while the rest of the building functioned as a museum and while it sat in the middle of the grounds of a functioning mental hospital. So it was kind of a chaotic time. And it hasn't passed. That's kind of still who we are as an organization. um, it makes me smile because I like to have a little bit of constructive chaos in my life. I think it's good for you. Dr. Bonsett and Dr. Keating were joined in their efforts by others, and together they began a campaign to protect and preserve the building and to establish it as a museum. And in September of 1969, less than a year after it closed as a laboratory, Governor Edgar Whitcomb authorized the group who had founded what was then called Indiana Medical History Foundation to do just that. And Dr. Bonsett also began working on an application to get the building listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which was approved in 1972. These founders, as we called them, raised money to complete a little bit of restoration work in the building. It was mostly some light plaster work and woodwork in the amphitheater. And then in 1971, Governor Whitcomb came back to the old pathology building to rededicate it. And that's what these pictures show. The photo on the left shows Governor Whitcomb and others, including Dr. Bonsett. Dr. Bonsett is the tiny little one in the middle. They're standing outside chatting before the ceremony. This is right outside of the building, and you can see there's another building in the background that is part of that old Seven Steeples structure, which was the Department for Women. It was torn down just a few years after these photos were taken. And then the other photo shows Governor Whitcomb speaking in the amphitheater on that same day. This is October 9th, 1971. I don't think we have time this evening to see all of the spaces in the building, but I did want to share a few with you. Um, this is the one we get the most use out of. The amphitheater was used for education. Medical students from the many proprietary medical schools in central Indiana and later exclusively from Indiana University School of Medicine came here to observe autopsies and hear lectures in psychiatry and neurology. There were also other formal classes coming to the building on occasion. Mortuary students would come here to learn how to embalm bodies. And law students sometimes came as well for lectures on different medical legal issues. So the amphitheater always got a lot of use. Today, it's where we begin our tours. It's where we kind of orient visitors to the hospital and prepare them for what they're going to see on the tour. But we also do a lot of public programs in this space, sort of traditional museum lectures, but also things like animal shows and movie screenings and things like that that I'll talk about later. The clinical chemistry lab was used for some research, but this was mostly a clinical lab that supported the hospital. During its peak in terms of patient population, there were about 2,000 to 2,500 patients at the hospital at any given time. There were also a lot of people, again, who worked on the grounds and lived on the grounds as well. And so the hospital served both of those populations. And these were all people who at different times had various medical conditions that required treatment or quarantine. And so there was a separate building erected that was called the Hospital for the Sick and Sane. It was more of a traditional hospital for those things, but the physicians who worked there would bring various body fluids and other things from patients for testing in the pathology department. And this is the histology laboratory. They were collecting tissue samples either from biopsies or during the autopsies and analyzing those materials. They were also just studying histology, the cell structure and tissue, and looking for ways that different diseases make physical changes to your body that basically prevent you from functioning as you're supposed to. And so this laboratory got a lot of space. It's on a north-facing side of the building. So the microscopes they had did not have electric lights. They had little mirrors on the bottom. So they chose this room for the microscopy because it had a lot of north-facing windows that would allow a lot of indirect natural light into the rooms that they could use to make the microscopes work. And this is the Anatomical Museum. This is where the specimens that were collected from autopsies for use as teaching aids or for later study were displayed for medical students and practicing physicians who would come to learn about the research that was being done in the building and see examples of these different physical causes of mental diseases. And all of these specimens are still there. A lot of people who haven't been to the building but have heard of us really only know about the specimen collection, but we're so much more than that. The building also has a large medical library, a records room, a photography studio, a bacteriology laboratory, an autopsy room, a reception room, all of these other space. I think there are 19 rooms in total that were dedicated to this research. And so all of these are visible if you come for a tour of the building. We also have other spaces outside of the old pathology building. In about 2005, we recreated the mid-century rural doctor's office of Dr. Marion Sheets in an adjacent building called the Dead House. Before there was electric refrigeration on the grounds of the hospital, bodies were kept there with large blocks of ice to prevent decomposition until the body could be embalmed or buried. They also would sometimes ship bodies home and things like that. So they needed a place to store these bodies before those things could happen. And now the space has been cleaned up quite a bit, and we've recreated the doctor's office here. This is basically stuff that all came from one doctor. This Marion Sheets practiced in the basement of his home in Louisville, Indiana, which is a really small town straight east of Indianapolis, almost to the Ohio border. It's a very rural area and was even more so then. He ran his practice in the basement of his home, and when he died in 1971, his wife locked up the basement and left everything the way it was. When she died about 30 years later, the family donated all these things to us so that we could recreate the space for public display in this dead house. I always forget how that sounds to, to other people. I have a weird job. I've been there a very, very long time, and so it sometimes forget. But this we could call it the ice house instead if that sounds better. We also have a medicinal plant garden. This was established to demonstrate native plants and plants that were brought to Indiana by settlers. These are all things that have traditional medicinal uses. So trees, shrubs, bushes, flowers, vines, all of these different kinds of plants. It grows every year. It expands every year and grows. Um, but it now includes walking paths and a memorial fountain that is dedicated to all people who have suffered from neurological disorders and diseases. So it gets more impressive every year. And in the last 10 years, we've seen an explosion of activity and progress as we continue to build on that past work. Um, our staff has expanded, our visitation has expanded. We've received a lot of media attention in recent years, both locally and nationally. We've been fortunate to be involved in a number of large national projects that are related to ethics and health and safety in museum collections. We have a collection of human remains. We also have quite a lot of chemicals that are part of our collection, which poses some interesting challenges as a museum professional. In most fields, when you have toxins in your workspaces, the goal is to get rid of those. But what do you do when the chemical is the collection and you have an ethical responsibility to preserve and maintain those. And they've also been useful too. We've been able to contribute to modern scientific projects. Um, the example that always comes to mind easily is our Indianapolis Museum of Art is now called Newfields, and they've been involved in a project for a number of years now with an international team looking for ways to identify fraudulent artworks based on the chemical composition of the paint. And because we have a very large collection of chemical stains that were used in the histology lab, we can contribute to that by providing samples of these historic pigments that we have preserved in our collection so that if these researchers want to know what Congo red was composed of in 1908 specifically, we can provide a sample of that. We've also been able to help by supplying specimens for IU School of Medicine's pathology department in a project that they've been working on looking for genetic markers for schizophrenia. And because we have all of the autopsy records. We have histological slides and tissue samples from all these autopsies, and the medical records for many of these folks still exist at our Indiana State Archives. That's a wealth of information that they've been able to use as they compare those things to modern samples looking for those genetic markers. So we've been uh, real busy. Last summer, we also completed a large capital campaign to save the old pathology building. We raised $2.2 million for preservation and upgrades to the building, which when I became the director in 2014 had some pretty significant structural issues and a lot of cosmetic problems as well. It needed a new roof, a lot of masonry work. We had 10 exterior doors and about 50 exterior windows that needed restoration work. We had 3 skylights in the building that were single pane glass with cracks, and they allowed condensation to drip down on the furnishings and artifacts below. So those had to all be replaced. We had to overhaul our HVAC system. We had some limestone on the outside of the building that needed some repairs, including the front steps of the building. Um, some of the chimneys needed to be rebuilt. And so there was all of this work. We still have a few things still to do on the list that we're working on for probably the next year or two, but the fundraising part is done. So the funds are there to complete this work, which is really a huge relief for us. Our grounds have also changed. I talked about the garden, but we also in the middle of a former hospital grounds. that was mostly abandoned since 1994, and there's been a lot of redevelopment in the last 10 years of that property as the city, it was state property, and then the city purchased it, and the city has been working with developers to, in some cases, reuse and rehabilitate the buildings, and in other cases, to demolish buildings and build new things. And so there's all of these changes to the grounds that have been happening, most of them fairly positive, I would say most, not all. Um, we have 6 acres of our property that we added a prairie patch and a native tree arboretum to as well. So this kind of expands on that mission to demonstrate medicinal plants. So we have native grasses and trees that are native to Indiana that we demonstrate in those spaces. And we've also been working to preserve the historic grove. That's where that rock garden was that I showed you earlier, to ensure that its use is in line with its original use and the idea of the healing power of nature, of coming together, and of reflection and remembrance. So we've been working to ensure that that remains an accessible green space for the community. We've been working on a project to identify and memorialize patients who are buried in the hospital cemetery as well. We've been a lot more creative with our programming. We've done relevant theatrical productions, movie screenings, hands-on science programs that are actually in the historic laboratory spaces, which is always very cool. Walking tours, we've done art workshops where our collections are used for like teaching the public how to draw or paint. You can see one of the plein air events down at the bottom of the screen. So with all of our events, we really try to tie the history with modern contemporary themes or issues to really drive home how relevant this history is for us today. And then a few years ago, this is in July of 2019, we unveiled a new interpretation of our anatomical collection in an attempt to rehumanize the specimens and tell their stories in a new way. We've really made a point in recent years of expanding our focus beyond the science and the technology and beyond the doctors and administrators who worked at the hospital, beyond the architecture itself, to draw more attention to the patients and their experiences. Those other stories are important and we haven't abandoned those, but we recognize that a big chunk of the history was not being told. And so what was obviously missing were the patients, and they're the reason the hospital existed in the first place. They're also the people who felt it hardest when things went wrong through lack of funds or abuse and neglect and those kinds of things. So we wanted to make sure that their stories were being told in the museum space as well. The collection consists of a lot of preserved organs. They're mostly brains, but of patients who passed away in the hospital and were autopsied in our building. These were originally preserved both as teaching aids and for further research. And as such, the original labels were very clinical descriptions of tumors and lesions and circulatory problems and all of those things that I mentioned earlier. And there was very little in the text that indicated it was actually a person that was being referenced in the label. So we're now telling the story from the patient's perspective as well. So the questions we were asking ourselves when doing this research is, who was this person and what was their life like before they were institutionalized? What impact did their symptoms have on their daily lives? Not just what went wrong inside their brain, but how did that affect their ability to hold a job, build meaningful relationships, start a family, things like that. Um, what what were the changes that led to their institutionalization, and how did they feel about that? How did their families feel about that? What was their experience like at the hospital once they were admitted? And with changes in technology and a better understanding of many of these diseases and conditions now, we also wanted to know, how might their experience be different today? How might their diagnosis, their prognosis, or their treatment be different given what we're capable of in medicine today. And so these are some of the things that we tried to cover. So across the board, we're pretty excited about all these things from our preservation work to the programming and outreach. And it's a lot. There's a lot going on. I think a lot of us feel pulled in a lot of directions, but it's also very rewarding work, and you can see the impact that it makes. So we're all very proud to be a part of it. And that's all I have for you today. I was hoping that there might be some discussion, but I don't know if we were able to do the Facebook Live, so maybe there won't be.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was very informative. And it sounds like you have a really large breadth of things that you do with your museum, which our museum could learn from, I think. Uh, Definitely. Brian Lynn, do you have any comments or questions that you would like to ask? Feel free to
No, it just
one.
looks pretty cool. I'll try to make it out there sometime if I ever can. Thank you.
Please do. I promise you will love it. It's the most magical place on earth.
Wonderful. I think I would like to try and make it out there myself. So we really appreciate you giving us that information and the wonderful presentation. eh, Very thorough and comprehensive. We will get it posted to Facebook. It'll probably take a couple of days and it will be up on our YouTube website as well, or our YouTube channel.
Great.
So, yeah, thank you for your time and effort and everything you do for your museum.
Thank you. I
You're
appreciate the opportunity.
absolutely. I guess we'll call it an evening and thanks again.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.